Good evening, mushroom nerds. This is a preface to the video that I'm about to share with you. So I realized a couple of things when I reviewed it. First of all, I didn't mention common names, and then secondly, I didn't mention edibility. So let's just go ahead and do that. I am perusing one of my favorite books, Mushrooms of the Carolinas by the Bessettes and Michael Hopping. So this is a great identification field guide. And for Lactarius paradoxus, which is sort of the star of the show upcoming, the name here is the silvery blue milky cap. And that makes perfect sense because the mushroom is a very pleasing silvery blue color. It is an edible mushroom, as is Lactarius cheledonium, which is sort of an orangey thing. And there's a Texas-based resource that calls Lactarius cheledonium the celandine milky cap, but I don't know anything about it besides that. But anyway, they are both edible. I don't eat them, and that's an abundance thing, not so much a preference. Well, it is a preference, and also a lot of times when I find those mushrooms, honestly, they're full of maggots. So I usually bypass that entire notion. As far as the Amanita mushroom that I show off, I don't know anything about edibility, and I certainly wouldn't recommend it. Amanita is a very challenging genus with some very toxic species in it. There are some tasty ones, and I have a dog approaching me. So I think I have shared enough from my study, and I hope you enjoy the video. Hey mushroom nerds, it's Anna McHugh. I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina, next to a ball field near my house. And I want to show you a couple of cooler weather mushrooms that I've happened across on my walk this afternoon, my constitutional. Two of which are sort of my favorites in a way to find. So one of the most beautiful mushrooms I've ever encountered was a specimen of this species. So this is Lactarius paradoxus, and it is one of those mushrooms that is highly variable in color, but is really characterized by a lot of purple coloration. You have some pink, you have some sort of silvery blue. It is just a great mushroom overall. So I'll talk about this species and how to identify it. Also, sort of a close relative of this mushroom. So this is Lactarius cheledonium. So it's got similar colors, but some slightly different behavior, and I will describe how you can tell them apart. And the reason that's fun is that, again, they are mushrooms that can fruit in cooler weather. I love the Lactarius genus overall for the simple reason that when you damage them, they bleed some sort of juice from their gills. So as you can see here, and this is kind of scant, but this is Lactarius cheledonium as best as I can tell. And it has sort of a, carroty orange or, darker, it can be sort of an orangey brown latex. And so that is sort of this lactating effect that you see on certain species of mushrooms. Also, Lactarius cheledonium and paradoxus are sometimes described as lookalikes for Lactarius indigo group. And so this is a really nice specimen of Lactarius paradoxus. And if you're familiar with Lactarius indigo group, it is sort of a, pale, oftentimes pale blue mushroom that when you damage it has a lot of this, abundant blue juice. It's very dramatic and very fun to mess with. But Lactarius paradoxus, when you approach it, you'll almost immediately see that it has more muted colors as far as the blue. So even if you have, a Lactarius indigo mushroom on your hands and it's blue, but it's really kind of faded, it's still, more blue on average than what you have oftentimes with Lactarius paradoxus. So you range from this sort of like silvery blue color. Sometimes they get these radical, sort of purple colors and splashes of different shades. But very frequently you'll have a purpley stem, and also this sort of pleasing pink-purple rim oftentimes develops. Is one of my favorite things about finding this mushroom, even when it's not like super dramatic, because, this species sometimes is just like over the top, very, you know, My Little Pony kind of coloration. And, you know, more often than not, it's a little more muted in color. But, you know, when it is really vibrant, it isn't vibrant blue. It's vibrant purple, pink, and also green. And that's a fun thing about the Lactarius genus overall, is you have a lot of these mushrooms that, you know, will bleed one color and are, you know, consistently one color. But as they get older, you start to see sort of a pattern of greenish staining. And so that one isn't terribly good. But this is another, you know, specimen of Lactarius cheledonium. And you can see sort of this pattern of greenish staining emerging. And that's a really common feature with a good number of Lactarius mushrooms, but certainly Lactarius cheledonium and Lactarius paradoxus have it. And, you know, when they're at their most dramatic, it's like orange and green, or, you know, purple and green, and it's very fun. So I have devised the moniker for this mushroom patch, mulberries and carrots, because that is the color of the latex. So I've been talking about, you know, the sort of bleeding effect of Lactarius mushrooms. Before I get into that, I've been trying to drink water, but, you know, let's go ahead and just do that. Okie dokie. So, when it comes to Lactarius paradoxus, you have sort of a like pale gill surface, but it is a little bit on the pinky side, but it's more of a like muted pink. So, you know, less dramatic than you might expect or see on the cap when it's really mature. But when you damage it, you'll see it has, you know, this really beautiful sort of mulberry reddish color. And, you know, if this were Lactarius indigo group, that would be like dark indigo color, dark purple blue, and it would go absolutely everywhere. Even though Lactarius paradoxus has very, very colorful latex, it's also scant. So if you look really closely, there's not a lot there. And also, over time, it will turn sort of a greenish color. So again, you have this like variability in what's happening with this mushroom. You know, I guess that may be why it's called Lactarius paradoxus. But, you know, it is one of those mushrooms I really like to encounter. Another thing that's real fun about it is that it has very small concentric growth zones, but not all that much. Like you have a little bit of sort of a zonate pattern here, but more you have almost like this, you know, not pebbled, but just roughened surface. And that's a little bit unusual because sometimes you'll find, you know, Lactarius mushrooms that are very zonate. And actually, Lactarius indigo group is a great example. So you have these big rings of different, you know, basically bands on the cap. But with Lactarius paradoxus, and also as you can see Lactarius cheledonium, you have like a vague hint or suggestion of that, but it doesn't go beyond sort of, you know, the outer perimeter of this cap. All right, so let's talk about Lactarius cheledonium more in depth. Sometimes this mushroom isn't nearly as orange, and so, you know, if you encounter it, here is the first specimen that I actually spotted. So I thought this was some sort of, you know, generic brown mushroom. But when I flipped it over, I'm like, oh, it's got this sort of, you know, green reaction, and then also a little bit of sort of reddish staining. You can see that where the maggots have been at it. You have a little stain here. But when the mushroom is, you know, young, it's very, it can be very orangey. And as with all mushrooms, there is taxonomy happening under the hood, so please bear with me if by the time you see this video, Lactarius cheledonium var cheledonoides, I think is the most appropriate thing to call this, may be called something different entirely. All right, so another thing that you'll notice about these mushrooms, as I mentioned, and you can see it a lot more clearly on this specimen, is sort of this dark reddish staining that happens, and that's over time. So you have, you know, your paradoxus, which is mulberry and green, and then your cheledonium, which is carrots, and then gosh, I guess red wine. So anyway, that's fun. Here's one final example of this Lactarius cheledonium, just to show you how sort of dingy brownish yellow they can become, and also their gills can be very sort of, you know, unimpressive. But let me show you this staining reaction on the, no, that's not, that one's not going to do it for me, but this one did. So you can see when I cut the base of the stem, I also got that nice, you know, sort of dark orangey color. All right, so let's move on to I just want to show you this particular Lactarius paradoxus piece that I saw emerging from the duff. So it had been knocked over, and you know, the one that I showed, well, actually this is perfect. So you can see this sort of nice medium purple. You can see a little bit of the green. The gills have a little bit of this you know, dark reddish color, and then on the back you have this blue mixed with the green staining, and sort of the staining reaction of the cap. So even though this be small, it is mighty as far as characterizing the species. All right, one more sip of water, and we're going to talk about a mushroom I am not familiar with, but I have done my best to key it out and identify it. And so it's an Amanita mushroom, so hold please. All right, so this mushroom I do believe to be Amanita media. And so there is a group of mushrooms, so it's Amanita canescens, Amanita media, and it may be pronounced Medea, but I have enough experience with classical literature that I'm not calling this Amanita Medea. So, you know, Amanita canescens, Amanita media, and Amanita radiata. So these three species are, you know, probably are a species group of some kind. I am way not advanced enough to talk about that. But in general, they're sort of these like gray Amanita mushrooms that have warts on the cap. And so additionally, you'll see that they have a base that has like a little bit of a chunky remainder of a universal veil, and sort of a small bulb. And actually right here you can see it forms like almost a little rim right here. Okay, and so in terms of the literature, this most closely resembles Amanita media of that like three species group that I was just talking about. Of course, I would be a fool to say that I landed on that identification the first time that I looked at this. So I keyed it out. I went to amanitaceae.org, which is like where advanced people learn about Amanitas, and people like me lurk. And, you know, the species description for Amanita media fits reasonably well. But, you know, again, we have these other species represented. But, so again, you have a grayish cap. And, you know, on this specimen, you have a little bit of striation. And that's something that, you know, maybe kind of falls in between those three species. Additionally, you have, you know, a whitish stem that is mentioned for Amanita media as opposed to the other ones I was mentioning. And again, sort of this like curved, you know, a little bit of recurved flesh right at the base, can form a little bit of a rim, and then also just a little bit of like chunky, you would call it flocculose material. So it's just a little bit fluffy, and it's sort of a dingy grayish color. So here's another specimen that has a pretty good, you know, representation of almost that little rim at the base of the mushroom, and then really nice just distribution of warts as well. They come off reasonably easily, but they're sort of a grayish brown, nothing super impressive. So when I first tried to identify it, I almost landed, you know, on Amanita onusta, which is known as the gunpowder Amanita, because it has, you know, a gray cap and sort of, you know, it has warts, but those warts are way more pronounced. So, you know, actually, this is a good opportunity to talk about Googling versus keying mushrooms out and going to authoritative resources. So when I started to look at this mushroom, I was like, I'm going to Google gray Amanita with prominent warts, and maybe, well, and I mentioned this little flocculose grayish material at the base, and almost immediately landed on all kinds of pages for Amanita anusta. Now, I went to iNaturalist and looked at a few observations of the mushroom, and it's like, yeah, no, that mushroom has much more pointy, warts on the cap. Additionally, it has like this rim of sort of material that hangs down from the margin of the cap, and so that's a feature called appendiculate. So anyway, at that point I was like, okay, well, it's this, my mushroom is not appendiculate. I'm gonna back out. I'm gonna go to a key of the Amanita genus and try to do my best. And then went to Amanitaceae to sort of like reinforce this, hypothesis of mine. All of that being said, I could totally be wrong. One way or the other, I'm not going to eat this mushroom. Amanita as a genus can have some really poisonous, or does have some very poisonous mushrooms in it. Another thing I'll mention about this is, like most Amanita mushrooms, this species has white gills. It also, let's see if one of the other ones has it. Oh, I was shaking it around too much and lost it. So there was sort of a remnant of a ring on the stem, and in the case of that sort of 3 species collection I was talking about, the ring is often lost easily. Now, there is also a collection of gray mushrooms in the Amanita genus called the Validae, and they are without rings on the stem and they're hollow inside. But I'm not going to go there because I'm not nearly enough of an expert to sort of talk about this. And in an effort to leave you with something perhaps a little more entertaining or at least authoritative, I'm going to do an experiential test of this little red Russula mushroom. So when mushroom season kind of comes to a close and we're, in early November, you start to see a dramatic reduction in the number of species, and it can be very difficult to keep your chin up. And so I'm always on the lookout for these little red Russula mushrooms. And there are so many red Russula mushrooms, I don't bother to try to identify them to species. But, they're usually this sort of universal, reddish color. Sometimes they will sort of become dull or, bleach out over time. But actually, this is a good chance to say, like, a lot of your Lactarius mushrooms have these zones and, pebbled kind of things going on. And a lot of your Russula mushrooms are more like matte and, uniform in terms of their coloration. There is a lot of variability in that, so take that with many grains of salt. But if you're looking at a mushroom from the top and they look kind of similar in some respects, oftentimes if it's really it's sort of consistent in color, oftentimes you're looking at a Russula. So Russulas also are very fragile, and so I'm beating this up as I'm talking about it. But the red Russulas, there's a lot of them, and they've got white stems, these beautiful sort of white gills, and many of them, let's see if this one has it. So many red Russula mushrooms and other Russulas and other mushrooms in general. Let me get rid of the rest of that. All right. No, not all clear. Okay. Wow. All right, we did it. So a lot of red Russula mushrooms in particular, but other species as well, have interesting, flavor features that can help you identify them or, at least impress your friends. So red Russulas sometimes have a very, very spicy flavor. If you want to show off, you can do what I did and chew a little bit of it and then spit it out. And, sometimes it'll give you a peppery flavor, and that's what just happened to me, and then it stuck to my tongue. Luckily, in this case, it is not a very strong peppery flavor. So here's another Russula that I desperately owe some identification work. Like, it lives in my backyard, and I haven't been disciplined enough to actually spend time with it, but it does have a marvelous crunch. And just, like Russula's is brittle and falls apart. This one's actually really quite tough. So that's loads of fun. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week and remainder of your mushroom season.